I want to, and I have decided to divide this week's audio lecture into two parts, either part one and part two, or part A and part B. I haven't decided how I want to label it, but one of the reasons why is just reviewing my notes before I started recording. It became clear to me that there's more that I wanted to talk about than I really felt comfortable including on one piece of audio, because I don't want you to sit and listen to something that long because it might just feel overwhelming and impenetrable. So for this first part, I want to talk about the Chestnut story and the Hopkins story. And for the second part, either B or two, I'll talk about the yellow wallpaper. But let's say a couple of things about Charles Chestnut, Pauline E. Hopkins, and this idea or this concept known as racial passing, because it's extremely important in Chestnut's story and in Chestnut's work. And it's interesting because every few years, it seems, today at least, we learn about a white person, a prominent, successful, and influential white person who has passed for large portions of their adult professional lives. A few years ago, someone named Rachel Dolezal, she was the NAACP president, I believe, of a Washington chapter of the organization. It was revealed that even though she had passed as a black person, she was in fact white. And as I'm recording this, just a couple of days ago, Jessica Krug, a George Washington University professor, was outed as not a person of color, but in fact, I believe a white woman, perhaps of Jewish heritage, from Kansas. And the sorts of racial passing that we see today, the examples that I just named, those are examples of white people passing as black. But what we see in the work of someone like Charles Chestnut is the complete opposite. And when people talk about racial passing, at least in a historical context in the United States, this is more often than not what they are speaking about: people of color who, because of their skin complexion, can pass and successfully pass as white. And what I wanted to do here quickly at the beginning is just say something about the ethics and the politics of racial passing within this particular historical context, because I think something that Chestnut does that's actually quite interesting is he tries to explain and understand why someone would choose, someone of color, why they would choose to pass as white, and he doesn't just dismiss it as unethical and the wrong thing to do, even though, to be completely clear, he does think it's the wrong thing to do. So if you are a person of color, or if you were a person of color in the late 19th and the early 20th century, a time where Jim Crow laws not only compromised the lives of black people, but also limited certain opportunities for black people in the United States, the justification for racial passing seems much clearer. Not only was it a way to protect yourself, to protect your actual physical body, but it was also a way to create certain opportunities for yourself, professional, cultural opportunities, the kind of opportunities or the kinds of opportunities that were simply not afforded to people of color in the United States for many, many years. Voting, for example, in the United States for people of color for quite some time was an extremely difficult and frustrating proposition. Securing housing was also extremely difficult. Certain redlining practices had the effect of sandwiching and situating people of color, especially in urban areas, into these pockets and enclaves, housing that was extremely expensive. It was poorly maintained, it was poorly regulated, and even opportunities for work and professional advancement. When we think about some of these tenets or characteristics of the American dream, we often think about how hard work is rewarded. But if you're a person of color, or if you were a person of color at the end of the 19th and well into the early 20th century, there was no amount of hard work that would just create opportunities for you if you were visibly black. The likelihood of experiencing the kind of personal and professional success that, again, we often associate with hard work, diligence, and sacrifice, that was not something that many people of color realized during this period. Therefore, the justification, the personal and the individual justification for passing becomes a lot clearer. And this is an idea that Chestnut wants to explore and understand in The Wife of His Youth. Charles Chestnut wrote not only nonfiction, but, as you can see with this story, a fair amount of fiction as well. And one of the ways that I like to think about Chestnut, and this, of course, is not the only way to think about him, is that through his fiction, he effectively dramatizes some of the points that I mentioned last week between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Because I think if you just wanted to take a macro view or a larger view of what both of them argue and what that suggests about the racial politics of the late 19th and early 20th century, they're both in many ways attempting to understand what it means to be a person of color in the United States after slaves were freed, after the momentary successes but ultimate failures of Reconstruction. And all of that is to say, they're asking this question, well, how do we navigate this world that is quite hostile to us? What does that look like? What do our politics look like? What do our social groups, what does this society of people of color look like? And how can we create a world that is equitable for ourselves while also recognizing and acknowledging the importance and the necessity of federal and state sanctioned, endorsed, and recognized equal rights? What does all of that look like? And I think what we get with Chestnut is someone who understands, especially if you think about a character like Mr. Ryder, he understands how, and he dramatizes how complicated those questions are. And even though a figure like Ryder, especially at the beginning, seems like he has, and this only becomes clear, of course, after you've read the story, but he's a character who you could argue has betrayed himself and to some degree betrayed his race. And this is something that Chestnut argued in his nonfiction quite explicitly, what it means to be a betrayer of one's race. And you can see him dramatizing those ideas in his fiction, for example, a story like The Wife of His Youth. But I think this is important because anytime you use a word or a phrase like betrayer, it almost automatically suggests that the person in question here, Mr. Ryder, is somehow unredeemable. But I think what Chestnut does that is really quite nice, he allows us to understand why he makes the choices he makes and why he made the choices he made. And Chestnut, again, he's remarkably sympathetic in stories like this because Ryder is not a character who we could just simplify and put into these oversimplified boxes. Again, he's not just someone who has betrayed his race. It's far more complicated than that. But why don't we just take a moment and talk about part one, which is the first couple of pages of the story. So we learn initially here on page 740 that he is extremely excited about this ball that he wants to throw, and he sees it as this culmination of his rise or his rank within this blue vein society. And I'll read directly from the story because I think it's important to understand what this social group ultimately represents. So this is on page 740. By accident, combined perhaps with some natural affinity, the society consisted of individuals who were, generally speaking, more white than black. Some envious outsider made the suggestion that no one was eligible for membership who was not white enough to show blue veins. The suggestion was readily adopted by those who were not of the favored few, and since that time the society, though possessing a longer and more pretentious name, had been known far and wide as the, quote, Blue Vein Society, and its members as the Blue Veins. The Blue Veins did not allow that any such requirements existed for admission to the circle, but on the contrary declared that character and culture were the only things considered, and that if most of their members were light-colored, it was because such persons, as a rule, had had better opportunities to qualify themselves for membership. So I'll stop here because I think what Chestnut ultimately wants to communicate with all of this is, so there's this exclusive society, the Blue Vein Society, and its members are light-skinned people of color, perhaps people who could pass as white if they were so inclined. And Charles Chestnut, I've mentioned this before, he had fairly light skin. If you just Google Charles Chestnut and look at images of him, you would be forgiven for just thinking, wow, is that a white guy? Are you sure? Do I have the right person? And this is a dynamic, as I've mentioned before, that was quite common in the late 19th and early 20th century, but even long before that, in the antebellum period, before the American Civil War, this practice by light-skinned people of color to pass as white. But what's interesting, and I would just encourage you to pay attention to the linguistic gymnastics here, because on the one hand, we're told, well, there's no explicit requirement for membership. We don't, as a society, this Blue Vein Society, we don't, as a society, have this rule that only light-skinned people of color can join. But isn't it funny how, because their skin is not as dark as some other people of color, they're afforded certain opportunities, which puts them in a position to be members of this society? You can see just how circuitous all of this is, because it's one of these moments where this society clearly doesn't want to just endorse this idea that we only want members who could pass as white, but they seem to only want members who could pass as white. And I'll address this again because this becomes such an important part of the narrative. But I think this is a moment where, especially as the story progresses, this is a moment where, as readers, we're asked to think, well, what's Chestnut's feelings about this, or what are his feelings about this? Is he writing this here as a way of endorsing or showing sympathy for this practice, or is he ultimately attempting to offer criticism of this practice? Again, that perhaps people who would, for whatever reason, as understandable as it might be, they're doing more harm than good by creating this kind of bifurcated society within the Black community where there are light-skinned people of color who are afforded an opportunity to pass. Well, what does that mean for everyone else? What does that mean for those people of color who cannot pass? What do their lives look like? What sorts of opportunities do they have? And this description of Mr. Ryder, I think, is quite interesting because it, again, gives us a better sense of perhaps Chestnut's feelings about this. And this is on page 741. His features were of a refined type. His hair was almost straight. He was always neatly dressed. His manners were irreproachable and his morals above suspicion. He had come to Groverland a young man and obtained employment in the office of a railroad company as messenger, had in time worked himself up to the position of stationery clerk, having charge of the distribution of the office supplies for the whole company. Although the lack of early training had hindered the orderly development of a naturally fine mind, it had not prevented him from doing a great deal of reading or from forming decidedly literary tastes. Poetry was his passion. He could repeat whole pages of great English poets, and if his pronunciation was sometimes faulty, his eye, his voice, his gestures would respond to the changing sentiment with a precision that revealed a poetic soul and disarmed criticism. He was economical and had saved money. He owned and occupied a very comfortable house on a respectable street. So a couple of things here, and I neglected to read perhaps the sentence before on page 741 where we learn that he was, quote, not as white as some of the blue veins. His appearance was such as to confer distinction upon them. So I think what Chestnut gives us with this description of Ryder is someone who, in not only his appearance and in his mannerisms, but also just in the way that he has fashioned his identity, he's someone who so desperately wants to appear, perhaps white, or he wants to cloak himself in the trappings of what he thinks is a kind of acceptable white identity. Notice, for example, just all of these references to his conservatism, his frugality. He owned and occupied a comfortable house on a respectable street. All of this feels, you're probably thinking, this feels like American dream territory, and I think you would be right. But also notice he loves poetry, but the poetry that he loves is white English poetry. We're told that he could repeat whole pages of great English poets. And who is Chestnut thinking about when he includes this kind of language? Well, he's thinking about those canonical figures like William Shakespeare, John Milton, Samuel Johnson, Alexander Pope. And these are, again, decidedly white figures. Even though Chestnut doesn't reference, at least at this moment, he doesn't reference any particular poets, I think the implication is quite clear. These are all white poets. So there's something about Mr. Ryder and this identity that he's constructed that the intent is to, if not pass as white, to cloak himself in the trappings of a specific and particular white identity. So we learn at the bottom of page 741 and on to page 742 that another reason for this bowl is because he has found a potential romantic partner. And there's something about this bowl that will function as a kind of culmination. And we're told that she was, quote, whiter than he, better educated. So there is, again, this sense that even with his romantic partner, that he has chosen someone who would create the conditions for him to experience and enjoy certain privileges. But Chestnut is, despite everything that I just said, Chestnut is still entertaining the idea, or he seems to want us as readers to entertain the idea that what Mr. Ryder does is something that we should at least attempt to understand. And we, even if we don't agree, and of course, once we arrive at the end of the story, we know that Mr. Ryder makes a different decision than the one he seems to want to make here. Chestnut wants us to at least understand why he would even want to make these decisions. And this is near the bottom of page 742. I have no race prejudice, he would say, but we people of mixed blood are ground between the upper and the nether millstone. Our fate lies between absorption by the white race and extinction in the black. The one doesn't want us, but may take us in time. The other would welcome us, but it would be for us a backward step. With malice towards none, with charity for all, we must do the best we can for ourselves and those who are to follow us. Self-preservation is the first law of nature. And I think this is important because even if this is not an idea that Chestnut endorses, and he certainly does not, he includes this dialogue so that, at least as readers, we understand the stakes for someone like Mr. Ryder. He seems to think, understandably so, that self-preservation is the right thing for someone in his position, but perhaps for anyone to pursue. And all I would argue you need to do is just put this story in a kind of historical context, and it becomes quite clear why self-preservation is so important. So we reach the end of section 1 with this picture and this characterization of a character like Mr. Ryder. And again, even though Chestnut will allow and permit this character to change by story's end, he clearly wants us to understand why Mr. Ryder has made the choices he's made to this point in his life. And he not only wants us to understand, but he wants us to perhaps entertain that there is something sympathetic about those choices and something potentially reasonable and rational about those choices, even if, again, he complicates all of this by story's end. So as we transition to section 2, we learn a little more information about Mr. Ryder, or Chestnut suggests or alludes to something potentially inconsistent, or a kind of inconsistency in this well-manicured identity that Mr. Ryder has constructed for himself. And it's the suggestion that he was once named Sam Taylor, and that he was a fugitive slave, and that he was at one point married to someone named Liza Jane. But before we get to that, I want to at least mention here on page 743 these references to Lord Tennyson, yet another one of these white canonical luminary figures. Again, just further developing this idea that I mentioned a moment ago about the kind of white accommodationist identity that someone like Mr. Ryder so desperately attempts to construct, because we're told that one of his favorite poets was Tennyson. But I think also in this description of Guinevere, we have this impression, or Chestnut wants to afford us an opportunity to understand what it is that Ryder potentially wants in a romantic partner, and it is this white feminine figure, someone like Guinevere. So this is on page 743. She seemed a part of joyous spring, a gown of grass-green silk she wore, buckled with golden clasps before a light green tuft of plums she bore closed in a golden ring. She looked so lovely as she swayed the rein with dainty fingertips. A man had given all other bliss, and all his worldly worth for this, to waste his whole heart in one kiss upon her perfect lips. So this is a kind of white archetype that a character like Liza Jane operates or functions in complete contrast to. And we meet Liza Jane immediately after this description of Guinevere on 743. And once again, I would encourage you just notice the contrast here. I'll read directly from the page on 743. She was a little woman, not 5 feet tall, and proportioned to her height. Although she stood erect and looked around with her very bright and restless eyes, she seemed quite old, for her face was crossed and recrossed with 100 wrinkles, and around the edges of her bonnet could be seen protruding here and there a tuft of short gray wool. We're also told on the next page that her hands look quite old and weathered and wrinkled, but the way she speaks is important too. And this is something that Chestnut did, which might remind you a bit of those sorrow songs from Du Bois from last week. And it's worth understanding that for someone like Chestnut, while this may look funny on the page, and while even if you try to read it, you might sound a little funny as you say it, none of this is meant or intended as a joke, or it's not here for humor and derision. For someone like Chestnut, this kind of slave dialect, it's something that he so desperately wants to keep and capture and preserve. And again, I think it becomes clear by the end of the story why he wants to do that. This is, for someone like Chestnut, an unmistakable part of the African American experience. This experience, this generational, this multi-generational experience with slavery and the horrors of slavery. And for someone like Chestnut, I feel comfortable saying that he wants anyone who is African American to understand just how important this part of their heritage is. And for someone like Chestnut, it's best expressed and best understood through just the presence of this slave dialect that, especially if you just juxtapose it with those passages from Tennyson on the previous page, it has this effect of not necessarily implying that one is superior and one's inferior. In fact, I think it's actually quite opposite. That for someone like Chestnut, he wants to create a space within his literature for this kind of slave dialect. He wants it to have a presence in American letters in the same way that references to Shakespeare or Pope or Tennyson might. But what she ultimately tells us is that she has searched for many, many years for her husband, Sam Taylor. And the two of them have this conversation, and there's certainly interesting layers, and Mr. Ryder, he, again, I think after you read the story and then return to this, it's quite clear what he's doing. But maybe reading it the first time, I'm not sure. I would love to know what your experience was like if you knew who he was the entire time, or if you didn't. But he's clearly trying to tease out as much information as he can from this conversation. And I think an interesting moment is on 745. He says to Liza, "Perhaps he's outgrown you and climbed up in the world where he wouldn't care to have you find him." To which she responds, "No, indeed, sir," she replied. "Sam ain't that kind of man." And what she basically says is that he just wasn't actually a very good worker, and that he only really worked when he was forced to do so. And I think this is also an important moment because it seems to show, for the many reasons why slavery is wrong, but on just a practical level, forcing someone to do something just won't work and can't work. It always creates the conditions for this kind of resistance. And I think that's just an interesting bit of information that Chestnut wants his reader to understand. It. This is something, for example, that Frederick Douglass wrote about quite persuasively, how, and Frederick Douglass, he's not someone that we are reading this semester, but his writing about, similar to someone like Booker T. Washington, he was a former slave. Now, unlike Booker T. Washington, he was also a fugitive who fled to the North prior to the passing of the 13th Amendment. But he often wrote about how, despite the horrors and the brutality that he experienced, there was always a part of him that resisted. And I think we're seeing Chestnut just support that idea, or support that notion that forcing or creating the conditions for someone who's in a subjugated position just to relinquish themselves to the subjugation, it doesn't take in its entirety, and it doesn't take in its totality. There's always resistance. And Sam, Mr. Ryder, he very much embodied that resistance. In part 3, so now let us just transition to part 3. This is the night of the ball, and I suppose Mr. Ryder has this choice to make, and it's not just a choice between one girl or the other, I suppose. And you can see how Chestnut, he's deploying some of the tendencies of this romantic triangle genre. You see this a lot in romantic comedies today, but for someone like Ryder, it's not just about choosing one potential romantic partner or the other. It's really about choosing what kind of black man he will be, what kind of black person he will be. Will he attempt to be this accommodationist figure who just wants to make himself seem as harmless and non-threatening as possible to a white majority? Or will he perhaps choose this other path, which might be a path better defined by struggle and resistance, something that feels more Du Boisian, perhaps? But before he ultimately reveals Liza Jane as his wife, there are these interesting meditative moments. For example, on 747, and notice the repetition of the word suppose. Suppose that this husband, soon after his escape, had learned that his wife had been sold away, and that such inquiries as he could make brought no information of her whereabouts. Suppose that he was young and she much older than he, that he was light and she was black, that their marriage was a slave marriage and legally binding only if they chose to make it so after the war. I think that's important as well. I haven't mentioned it, but this was not a legally recognized marriage because it was a slave marriage. Suppose, too, that he made his way to the north, as some of us have done, and there, where he had larger opportunities, had improved them, and had in the course of all these years grown to be as different from the ignorant boy who ran away from fear of slavery as the day is from the night. Suppose even that he had qualified himself by industry, by thrift, and by study to win with friendship and be considered worthy the society of such people as these I see around me today, gracing my board and filling my heart with gladness. For I am old enough to remember the day when such a gathering would not have been possible in this land. Suppose, too, that as the years went by, this man's memory of the past grew more and more indistinct, until at last it was rarely, except in his dreams, that any image of this bygone period rose before his mind. And then suppose that accident should bring to his knowledge the fact that the wife of his youth, the wife he had left behind him, not one who had walked by his side and kept pace with him in his upward struggle, but one upon whom advancing years and a laborious life had set their mark, was alive and seeking him, but that he was absolutely safe from recognition and discovery, unless he chose to reveal himself. My friends, what would the man do? I will presume that he was one who loved honor and tried to deal justly with all men. I will even carry the case further and suppose that perhaps he had set his heart upon another whom he had hoped to call his own. What would he do, or rather, what ought he to do in such a crisis of a lifetime? And I think I'll pause here for a moment because I think this is another moment where Chestnut, it's clear what he thinks is the right choice, and we'll see that on the next page. But that's not to say that he just vilifies the alternative, because I think what Chestnut offers us here is this full, robust picture of what a person of color who could pass might feel when contemplating whether or not they should. Because it's never as simple as we might think. And maybe we don't think it's simple, but I think we often have the tendency to reduce these kinds of moral choices and decisions to a rather simplified, well, here's the right option and here's the wrong option. And again, that's not to suggest that Chestnut doesn't think there's a right and wrong option. He does, but he's trying to afford us, through this wonderful short story, an opportunity to see and experience, through perhaps feelings and these kinds of elongated meditations, just the difficulty of the choice, whether to pass or not. And in Mr. Ryder's decision to embrace and recognize Liza Jane, I think we have something quite powerful and transcendent, because it's not as simple as, well, Ryder just finally embraced the truth, and because of that, he did the right thing. There's far more required for him to do this. He had to commit a kind of symbolic suicide. And this is a term, and I wanted to be very clear and very specific about this. Symbolic suicide, it's this concept that theorists and writers use to understand the kinds of choices that a character like Ryder makes. If, for example, you like the television show Mad Men, there's a wonderful example of symbolic suicide in that show when one of the main characters, and it's different because he's white and he's not black, passing as white, but he has constructed this comfortable identity for himself, and by doing that, he's rejected the past. But there is this moment when he just acknowledges his past, and by doing so, he completely eradicates this symbolic identity that he created for himself. And I wanted to just offer this is an informal definition, but I think it's quite applicable to what Ryder experiences in this story. And this is, again, a definition of symbolic suicide. Quote, a withdrawing from symbolic reality that enables us to begin anew from the 0 point. This gesture temporarily voids symbolic mandates to open up the possibility of adopting different ones and assuming a new symbolic identity. And I think for someone like Mr. Ryder here, this is precisely what he's afforded for himself by acknowledging and by recognizing Liza Jane. He has enabled himself to begin anew in many ways. Now, that's not to say that the path forward will necessarily be a comfortable one and a convenient one, but he's stripped himself of this symbolic identity that a figure like Chestnut would argue, while it may create, for a time, certain comforts, it won't actually accomplish what someone like Mr. Ryder wants to accomplish. It won't. This identity that he spent so long constructing, it won't create the conditions for a more equitable society for people of color. And this is precisely something that Du Bois referenced and Du Bois attempted to unpack in the reading from last week, that it's really this misguided maneuver that, again, while it may create and it may produce certain comforts, it won't have the kind of long-term equitable effect that everyone from Booker T. Washington to W.E.B. Du Bois to even Charles Chestnut wants to see. And I thought I would just read the final paragraph as a way of finishing this conversation about the wife of my youth. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, this is the woman, and I am the man whose story I have told you. Permit me to introduce to you the wife of my youth. And the story ends here. And perhaps some of the questions I would encourage you to entertain, especially if you wanted to write about this story. What does Chestnut think about the life that Mr. Ryder and the members of this Blue Vein Society want to create for themselves? Does he seem to understand and sympathize with their motivations? But if he ultimately thinks it's a failed project, well, what's the alternative? Is it what Ryder does here at the end, embracing his past, committing, again, a kind of symbolic suicide regarding this accommodationist identity that he created for himself, this identity that might at times allow him to pass as white? And perhaps something else worth thinking about is, why does Chestnut end the story where he does? We don't see what Mr. Ryder's life might look like after this momentous decision. And if that's part of the point, well, what's the point exactly? So again, this is, I would argue, a spectacular story that does so many fantastic things, and it's a way, because I know for a lot of students, reading, while Washington certainly uses narrative, reading figures like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, at times, these dense theoretical texts can be a bit challenging. I think reading someone like Chestnut is great because it certainly feels like, whether it's intentional or not, he's applying some of those theories to something fictional, or he's using fiction, characters, and narrative as a way of dramatizing some of these ideas and some of these concepts. So I wanted to take a quick second and say something as well about the Pauline E. Hopkins story, A Dash for Liberty. Again, such a fantastic short story, and it's a fantastic short story for a couple of different reasons, because you can certainly feel, if you are familiar with this kind of romantic literature, you could imagine this story feels a lot like, I don't know, my mother, for example, would always read these romance novels when I was a child, and there was always this bare-chested Fabio figure on a boat. They're always on a boat on the cover art, and he's embracing a scantily clad woman. You know, those kinds of romantic novels and romantic stories. This certainly feels at times like one of those as well. But what Hopkins does that's quite interesting is that she inverts everything. So the heroes and the heroines are people of color. And there's also an element of this story that feels like a revenge, even a fantasy narrative, especially when thinking about what Madison accomplishes, right? He rescues Susan, and he does so against what feels like unbelievable odds. But this is also a story that wants us to see and understand the power, the beauty, and the majesty of the black body. Notice, for example, in particular, the descriptions of Susan, which might remind you of those descriptions of Guinevere from the Tennyson poem that's cited in the Chestnut story from earlier. I'm reading directly from the story. This is on page 246. She lay stretched at full length, with her head resting upon her arm, a position that displayed the best advantage, the perfect symmetry of her superb figure, the dim light of a lantern played upon the long black ringlets, finely chiseled mouth, and well-rounded chin, upon the marbled skin veined by her master's blood, representative of two races. To which did she belong? And that's certainly an interesting question, but throughout this story, there are, and again, I think it's important to acknowledge that for someone like Hopkins, Susan is certainly a person of color, but her body is described as, again, something beautiful and majestic, not a perversion or something disgusting. And we even see with a figure like Madison the power of his body as well. He's quite a formidable figure. This is on, for example, page 247. The crew were all on deck. The 3 passengers were seated on the companions smoking. The appearance of the slaves all at once completely surprised the whites. So swift were Madison's movements that at first the officers made no attempt to use their weapons, but this was only for an instant. One of the passengers drew his pistol, fired, and killed one of the blacks. The next moment he lay dead upon the deck from a blow with a piece of a capstan bar in Madison's hand. The fight then became general, passengers and crew taking part. So notice Madison, he's defined as moving swiftly. But even early in the story, this is on the first page, Madison was an unmixed African of grand physique and one of the handsomest of his race. His dignified, calm, and unaffected bearing marked him as a leader among his fellows. His feature bore the stamp of genius. His firm step and piercing eyes attracted the attention of all who met him. He had arrived in Canada along with many other fugitives during the year 1840, and being a strong, able-bodied man and a willing worker, had sought and obtained employment on Mr. Dixon's farm. So, again, just the way Hopkins wants to, through these sorts of descriptions, just celebrate the black body, something that far too often, especially when thinking about this period, was the source of pain and violence. It was something that people in positions of power abused and denigrated and destroyed. But here in Hopkins' hands, it's something to be celebrated. It's something beautiful and majestic and wonderful. But also, again, we see Hopkins indulging in some of these conventional narratives, because this at times feels a lot like a hero's journey. But I think the important thing, I think the distinction is that it's a hero's journey for people of color, featuring black characters, written by a person of color. And I think all of that matters too, especially if we think back to someone like Mr. Ryder from The Wife of His Youth. So many of his favorite literary figures and poets, they're all white, and there's a reason why, and I don't think I need to explain why. But part of the work of the last half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, when thinking about how literary canons are constructed, or again, the sorts of stories and essays and poems that appear in the anthologies that you read in these kinds of classes, so much of the work that people have tried to do is well, create more equity, find space for writers like Pauline Hopkins, because it's clear that she is quite interested in many, many things, but one of the things she clearly wants to do is to create literature not only featuring people of color, but by people of color. Okay, so for time considerations, because I feel like I have maybe talked a little too long, maybe I did give short shrift to the Hopkins piece, but it's a fantastic story. If you want to write about it, I would encourage you to. It's certainly one of my favorites, and again, I think it's representative of what prominent writers of color were attempting to do with the literature they produced in this period and during this period. So, okay, this is the end of part one, or part A. I mentioned at the beginning that because I had so much to talk about this week, and I didn't want you to just listen to, I don't know, 90 minutes of me talking, that I would divide this week's lecture into two parts. So I'll be back probably tomorrow with the second part. But until then, this is Colin Cox for Modern American Literature.